risking his own life.
He's basically revealed truths about the country and about the Chinese Gulag system that they would have preferred to keep secret and hidden.
I know there's a risk.
He's even putting U.S.-Chinese relations at risk.
It is unfortunately a serious irritant in an already difficult situation between the U.S. and Chinese governments.
I think that's really all Harry wants to do, is to show people what the truth is.
Tonight, Harry Wu's obsession, President Clinton's dilemma.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
There is, in a current commercial, a throwaway brain teaser along the lines of, sure, you're 1 in a million, which means that there are only 1,000 people just like you in China. Actually, it'd be more like 1,200, since the population of China is now around 1.2 billion, which is a number that drives American entrepreneurs to distraction. After all, if you could just tap into 10% of the Chinese market, you'd be talking about 120 million customers. It hasn't worked out that way, of course. In 1993, for example, the U.S. sold almost 100 times as much to Great Britain as to China. And actually, relations between China and the United States were a lot better 2 years ago than they are today. China has recalled its ambassador from Washington and has refused to receive the new U.S. ambassador. Washington is convinced that the Chinese are selling missile components to Pakistan and Iran, which they had promised not to do. The Chinese have further announced missile tests off the coast of Taiwan and awarded a $1 billion contract to Mercedes that Chrysler thought it was going to get. And then, of course, there's the arrest of Harry Wu. Harry Wu is not the problem. He's a symptom of the problem. But as Brian Ross reports, Mr. Wu is a very prominent symptom indeed.
3 times before, Harry Wu had been able to sneak into China with his hidden cameras. Each time, secretly taking pictures like these that ended up on World News Tonight or 60 Minutes, exposing the brutal Chinese prison system where forced labor is used to make products that Wu said were often ending up in American stores.
You make money, you make profit from these people's life. You have to feel guilty.
As a man who had spent 19 years himself as a political prisoner in China, almost dying from torture and starvation, Harry Wu knew the growing risk of what he was doing. But he was tireless, relentless in his effort to get the world media to pay attention to what he called the Chinese Gulag system of prison camps. If they had caught Harry Wu taking these pictures, what would happen to you?
Go back to the camp.
Last year, Wu became an American citizen, traveling with an American passport and entering China by traveling through Central Asia with no problem. Last month, for the 4th time, he took that route and that risk again. Why did he go back a 4th time?
Harry believes that he's the voice for the victims of the Chinese Gulag, that he is getting older, that he's not done.
Jeff Fiedler of the AFL-CIO, which has helped finance Wu to expose Chinese labor conditions and protect American jobs. Did you say this time, Harry, don't go?
Yeah.
He had to know it was dangerous, maybe even really foolish.
I mean, he understood it was dangerous. He always calculated the danger. Harry's not a foolhardy person. He's just determined and dedicated. And he thought that once he got in, he always thought that the difficult time was going in and going out.
Which is just what happened last month. This time, this remote border crossing in northern China, which Wu had used before, had a new computer hookup to Beijing that flagged Wu's name.
At that time, we knew someone was coming from Beijing. That's more serious. We knew we weren't going to get away with someone coming from Beijing.
You were caught?
That we were definitely caught. The local people might not know who they had, but if someone from Beijing was coming, then they knew who Harry Wu was.
Sue Howell, who was traveling with Wu as his assistant, was also taken into custody and held with Wu for days in a small room of what was called a police guest house, waiting for the officials from Beijing.
And Harry said, what do you think? Should I try to escape? I think maybe I should try to escape. And we talked about it. He said, I think it's just maybe 4 kilometers until I'm on the other side. And he weighed the pros and cons, and I was very relieved when he decided not to make a break for it.
You were?
Yes. I mean, I was afraid for him to stay there, but I felt if he tried to run, it would be a perfect excuse to shoot him.
The next day, Sue Howell was expelled from China, and Harry Wu was taken away, charged with crimes against the state, crimes punishable by death. Now, Harry Wu's arrest has given him the kind of attention in Washington that he was never able to achieve with all his undercover tapes, as his wife Ching Li made the rounds from the White House to the Speaker of the House.
I hope Harry can come back soon.
Further straining relations between the U.S. and the Chinese.
They're behaving in a way that is not tolerable, and to arrest an American citizen is not acceptable.
The administration is clearly in a bind.
Why?
Because difficult decisions have to be made. They have to decide whether they're going to face up to the Chinese. Harry's arrest has crystallized the question of how America should deal with China.
Which is exactly what some American business people and the Clinton administration are afraid of. That in retaliation for the arrest of Harry Wu, Congress could vote to cut off China's special trade privileges. Robert Kapp, the president of the U.S.-China Business Council, says that's no way to send a message about Harry Wu.
If you support Harry Wu, break trade with China. If you don't support Harry Wu, sustain trade with China, everybody's going to say, well, I support Harry Wu.
What's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with it, in my view, and in the view of many in the business community, it does nothing to get Harry Wu out. It is an effective way to initiate an essentially catastrophic, long-term further deterioration of U.S.-China relations, which is not in the U.S. national interest.
Bad for business.
I'm sorry, sir. It is not a question of bad for business. And as I said before, business wants Harry Wu out, and out quick.
But the fact is, Harry Wu has long been bad for business, embarrassing not only the Chinese, but many American companies doing business with the Chinese. Like Walmart, where Wu and his people took along their cameras as Wu tried to get shareholders to pass a resolution against Chinese forced labor products.
Making products for export. Your time is up, I'm sorry.
Wu was cut off and his resolution voted down as Walmart officials denied buying any such forced labor products.
I view this as nothing more than a disruption of our meeting, and I suggest to all of you that you simply mark your ballot against.
Harry is unafraid of confronting anybody or anything,
Whether it's Walmart
or China.
And now Wu is more than ever on the minds of American business. In this memo sent to its member companies, the U.S.-China Business Council warned of possible problems in Congress because of Wu, and then said, in a statement that has angered Harry Wu's friends, quote, "It strikes us that the timing of the entire incident is, at best, mysterious."
I find that statement personally and morally offensive.
Why?
Because it basically implies that Harry set the whole thing up as a game.
If I'm not mistaken, I wrote that.
Kapp says he wasn't talking about Harry Wu, but about the Chinese.
Were there people in China who favored his detention because they had a specific desire themselves, for reasons that I can't lay out for you, to exacerbate tensions between the U.S. and China?
The people who are close to Mr. Wu think that memo says you think Harry Wu wanted to get arrested.
I have absolutely no view on whether Mr. Wu went to China thinking that in this case he would be arrested.
I think they're scared. Scared of what this means to their business interests.
It's clear from this videotape Harry Wu made, to be released in the event of his capture, that he knew the stakes were high, but worth it.
It seems they can destroy me. They can eliminate me. It seems like that. But if you look in the long term, the truth is on my side.
When we come back, we'll be joined by 2 specialists on China, a former ambassador to China and a China scholar just back from Beijing. Joining us now from Denver International Airport, where he is quite literally between planes, James Lilly, Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He was ambassador to China for the United States from 1989 until 1991. And joining us from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Ken Lieberthal is a professor and was director of the university's Center for Chinese Studies. He has just returned from a trip to Beijing, so let me begin with you, Professor Lieberthal. How bad are U.S.-Chinese relations right now, and to what degree is that a function of what's happened with Harry Wu, or is Harry Wu's arrest a function of the deteriorating relations?
I think both of the above. The state of the relationship is very bad. I think the Chinese now are beginning to think of the U.S. not as a basically cooperative partner with whom they have problems, but rather as increasingly as a long-term adversary. And they see evidence in various places that the U.S. real strategy in their minds is one to contain, weaken, isolate China. And the American reaction to Harry Wu's arrest, a reaction that included a comment by the Speaker of the House calling for trade sanctions against China and for American recognition of Taiwan as an independent country, those kinds of reactions, I think, simply fed the arguments of those in Beijing who take the dimmest possible view of the future of Sino-U.S. relations.
Ambassador Lilly, to what degree are the Chinese, those who believe what Professor Lieberthal has just said, being a little bit too kind? In other words, do you think that the United States at the moment has an active China policy, and if so, what is it?
I think the United States has to get this Harry Wu case under control. He's a brave man. He has a martyr complex in the true Chinese condition. But I think we have to raise him as part of a commitment on both sides to improve the relationship. We have to handle it without most favored nation linkage and without ostentatious pressures.
When you talk about most favored nation linkage, you are referring to something that actually comes before the House of Representatives tomorrow. The House may or may not vote tomorrow on whether to continue giving most favored nation treatment in trading policy to China. How devastating do you think it would be if indeed the House were to vote against most favored nation treatment?
Well, I think it would be a disaster, but as you know, this has happened before. The House voted during the Bush administration against most favored nation, and President Bush vetoed it. The question now is whether President Clinton would veto it and push on his most favored nation extension for China. It puts him in the spot.
You were diplomatic enough, I guess, as a former diplomat, to avoid the direct thrust of my question to you before, which was whether indeed you perceive there to be a real China policy, or whether in fact things are just drifting right now between Beijing and Washington.
Well, let me put it this way, Ted. I think that we can establish a China policy now, but the first step is a resumption of United States-Chinese strategic dialogue. We've got to get to these anomalies in our relationship, understanding, exchanging on a new security arrangement in Asia, dealing with the whole problem of containment of China versus constructive engagement, confidence-building measures, and defense conversion. We've got to deal very frankly with the PRC military buildup, its power projection, versus a multilateral handling of this, and peace with its neighbors. We have a whole series of things we have to deal with in China, plus the fact we have to urge the Chinese to resume cross-state talks with Taiwan immediately. Great progress has been made in these cross-strait talks with Taiwan and China, and it's been broken off by China. It should be started again right away.
Professor Lieberthal, we've been focusing primarily on the U.S. side of the equation, but to what degree is the current tension a function of the Chinese government itself being in transition, waiting in effect for Deng Xiaoping to die?
I think this is a time in Beijing where it's hard to get bold moves to build bridges to the United States. Every leader there is taking care to protect his nationalist credentials. Each wants to appear strong, wants to preserve China's honor and their own integrity. And so it's not a time when you have a man like Deng Xiaoping, an utterly commanding presence, who can sweep aside the day-to-day issues and say we have a strategic interest here that we really must put up front and to which we must adhere. So I think on the Beijing side there are problems in this relationship too. It's not solely Washington's fault.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to take a short break. We'll be back with more in a moment. And we're back once again with former U.S. Ambassador James Lilly and China scholar Kenneth Lieberthal. Professor Lieberthal, the People's Republic of China, the government in Beijing, was absolutely livid when the president of Taiwan was permitted to come into the United States for the purpose of, what did he do, deliver a commencement address or receive an honorary doctorate? Why were they so furious about that?
The people in Beijing are worried sick about the possibility that Taiwan will declare independence. As Taiwan has democratized, politicians there increasingly play to public sentiment, and the rhetoric has moved Taiwan more and more in the direction of a more independent stance. I think Beijing's biggest problem with this is they don't know how to react to it. They just don't know how to bring it under control, and yet no Chinese leader thinks that he politically can survive simply allowing Taiwan to go independent. The U.S. stepped into this picture in allowing the president of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui, to come to the United States for a private visit. That was offensive on two grounds. One ground was that it effectively relaxed a previous stricture we had that prevented someone at Lee Teng-hui's rank from coming to the U.S., therefore potentially further encouraging Taiwan's quest for greater international status. Secondly, I understand that Secretary of State Christopher had personally told his counterpart, the Chinese foreign minister, only very shortly before the White House announcement, only a matter of a week or so before, that this visa would not be granted.
That was exactly the point that I was just going to raise with Ambassador Lilly. How can that kind of a foul-up be allowed to occur in the diplomatic dealings of two countries? How can the Secretary of State be put in a position where he gives an assurance which then a few days later is countermanded by the White House?
Well, I think the whole business of Lee Teng-hui was mishandled from the beginning, from the time we wouldn't let him land in Hawaii, to the Taiwan policy review, which was a fraud, to this reversal of policy on Lee Teng-hui. But let me just make this point. I think that in Lee Teng-hui's case, the Chinese gave us wrong signals. They stood by while he went to Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines, UAE, and Jordan. They did not take action against any of these places, and yet they take violent exception at what we do. They gave us the wrong signals on this one. What you have is a problem here of weak transitional governments with nationalistic aspirations and lacking in foreign policy experience interacting each other. You look at the two fundamental principles engaged on Taiwan. We support free markets and democracy, and Taiwan is both. We will not allow these to be interfered with. In China's sense, they want sovereignty not to be violated. We will not violate sovereignty. It seems to me you can steer a course between these two positions, and we've been doing it for the last 20 years, and we can do it now.
Professor Lieberthal, that brings me back to where we began, and that is the subject of Harry Wu. Harry Wu is the kind of man, and his arrest represents the kind of issue that people can get their arms around. I mean, even people who have no understanding whatsoever of U.S.-Chinese relations can understand that when a courageous man exercises his convictions and goes back to China to expose the prison gulag, that's the sort of thing that Americans get behind. But this could also prove terribly destructive, couldn't it?
You're exactly right, and what you point to is a failure of the administration to lay out our overall interests with China, where we need to head with that country, what is required in order to get there. And therefore, the news about the U.S.-China relationship that we see in the United States is always dominated by the very short-term things, whether it be Harry Wu or the Chinese reaction to the Lee Teng-hui visit or other items. I believe the President and the White House can seize leadership on this, but they have to be willing to make the effort to make the case to the American people. We have seen in the past, in the Nixon presidency and ever since then, that where a president really will seize the bull by the horns on this issue, the American people are willing to be supportive. Where the president lets it drift, the relationship gets into very serious trouble very quickly.
A very quick question to both of you. I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast that there has been this illusion of a market of 1.2 billion people in China. And I think part of the frustration among the American public, and certainly in the U.S. Congress, is due to the fact that somehow this image of this gigantic market has never really come into reality for the United States. They sell an awful lot more here than we sell over there. Ambassador Lilly, how much of a problem is that?
It's a serious problem with the $30 billion trade surplus, but you just remember, we sell twice as much to Taiwan with 21 million people as we sell to China. We've got to deal with the specific problems of market access, intellectual property right protection, China entry into GATT, and adherence to world standards. Those are the problems. We should address them directly.
Professor Lieberthal, a quick comment, and it'll have to be the last one, I'm afraid, on that same issue.
I agree with that. The major allure of the China market is that China remains the most rapidly growing major industrial economy in the world. It has done so for more than 15 years. The projections are for continuing high rates of growth, and so presumably patience and good political relations will let us participate in that effectively.
And yet at no time over the past few years has the promise turned into reality for the United States. Why not?
Well, that's not strictly true. If you talk to the people in the American aircraft industry and American telecommunications and other major sectors, they'll tell you a different story. But certainly in terms of overall trade, yes, it hasn't progressed as rapidly as any of us would
And
like.
yet, at this very moment, the Chinese are threatening their contract with Boeing, which is, of course, one of the biggest that exists.
Inevitably, politics laps over into the economic sphere. A very bad political relationship inevitably over time will harm our commercial interests in China.
Professor Lieberthal, Ambassador Lilly, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
I'll be back in just a moment.